So let's look at our basic drawing tools. Let's look at the vector brushes and vector tools first. So we're going to do a quick rundown of the tools in the toolbar here and what they're for. Some of these we'll cover in another video, but we want to get the basics out of the way. You'll notice that we have both a pencil and a brush tool. If I make a stroke with each one, they might seem very similar. Both let me make a pressure-sensitive stroke that look a lot alike. But if I use the Contour Editor tool to modify the vectors that make up the stroke, you'll see that they're quite different. The Pencil tool made a single vector, and the thickness was determined by my drawing tablet's pen pressure as I drew it. I can use the Contour Editor to manipulate the path of this stroke, but its essential character looks the same. But with the brush tool, it actually created a shape with a vector defining the edge. The property panels for the two tools is pretty similar as well, and a lot of the functionality is the same. The Pencil tool just has these drop-downs for defining whether to cap the start and end of a stroke, and how to handle sharp corners. You probably just want those set to round. And then it has this auto close gap option, which will make an invisible connecting stroke between the ends of two pencil strokes if they're close enough together. This is meant to make it easier to use the Paint Bucket tool to fill in an area outlined with the Pencil tool. Now, the Pencil tool is meant for doing really precise lines, which usually isn't what we're concerned about with storyboarding. So I'm going to focus on the Brush tool. So the first thing to note about how the Brush tool works is that if I paint an area with one stroke, not lifting my pen, and then select it with the Selection tool, you can see that it's one big shape. But if I color an area with multiple strokes and use the Selection tool, you can see each brush stroke is still separate. This is especially apparent if you have the color picker set to use a lower opacity stroke. Then multiple overlapping strokes will build up the opacity. This means the brush tool can be used for doing lines or filling in large areas with color. It just depends what size your brush is set to. Now, by default, each stroke you draw gets laid down on top of the previous ones. I'll use two different colors so you can see the difference. But if we enable the Draw Behind option, new strokes go behind existing ones. And if you wanted separate strokes to merge together, you can enable Auto Flatten. Then, separate strokes combine as if they were drawn at once. That's the basics of how the brush works. Now, let's look at the different settings. Let's select this Brush 1 preset and look at its settings. You can see in the panel we have sliders for the maximum size, so what's the thickest the stroke can be when you've got the heaviest pen pressure on your drawing tablet. And smoothing, meaning how much should the computer correct for any wobble in your pen stroke. If we click this arrow button next to the preview up here, we have more specific options. You can set the maximum size and the minimum size as a percentage of the max. So this changes how much variation there can be in the size of your strokes based on your pen pressure. And then we have separate sliders for smoothing, which smooths the overall path of the brush, so it smooths the wobble in the motion of your stroke, whereas contour smoothing smooths that vector line that defines the outside of the stroke. So it basically would smooth any wobble in the pressure of your pen. Then if we enable this Paper Texture tab, we also have the option to make a texture brush. This makes it look and feel more like a bitmap brush. You can choose one of these paper textures and adjust the hardness of the texture. You can also adjust the minimum and maximum opacity, so that's pressure sensitive in addition to size. And we can scale the texture to make it larger or finer. Now remember that the stroke a texture brush puts down is just a vector shape with a bitmap image filling it in. It can't be modified like other vector brush strokes. Now when we have settings we like, we can save them. If we click this Update Brush Preset button, it would change that Brush 1 preset to have these settings instead. But let's use this button to just add a new preset to the list. We just give it a name, and it gets added to the list. We could have also added that preset using this Add button here. Now right here, there's another button, New Dynamic Brush. A dynamic brush lets you select something on your canvas, turn it into a dynamic brush, and that shape becomes a brush tip that you can use to paint with copies of that shape. This is good for things like leaves and grass, or even crowds of people if you're clever with it. If we make a set of brush presets we like, we can use this drop-down to export the list of presets. Here you can choose just specific brushes to export if you want. Keep in mind that this list includes all the brushes for the Vector Brush tool, the Vector Pencil tool, the Vector Eraser tool, and the Bitmap Brush tool. If you wanted just the vector brushes, use this to deselect all and just check the pencil, brush, and eraser, or whichever ones you actually want. Click Export and give the file a name and a location on your hard drive. Then later you can use that same drop-down and import brushes to import that XML file. That's it for the brush tool. Now I just wanted to point out that the settings for the eraser tool works largely the same way. It just obviously erases instead of putting down color.